watch the night setting in behind me as we go. What I'm going to do is run us quickly through the growth of the European Union, so what it is basically, have a quick look at its institutions, how it makes decisions, and then we'll pick up what it makes decisions about. And then we'll have a look at what those areas that it makes decisions about, it will no longer make decisions on behalf of the UK. So we then end up by looking at the areas of difficulty in the current negotiations between the European Union and the UK. What we, in my view, are not going to do is discuss whether we should or should not have left, because we have kind of done that. So I'm hoping to not do that again. The European Union is not and never has been a socialist organisation, and in my view, it never will be. However, it is occasionally social democratic. Okay, and that's really all I want to say about its politics, really, for the time being. The whole sort of stuff started in 1951. So we're in the post-war period, and the first 6 nations that got together were the former combatants. So right from the early days, the European Union has had a sort of double function. One is to keep the major combatants of Europe from actually slaughtering each other yet again, because they had rather a long history of doing so. So it was founded by France, Germany, Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy. And that's actually with the Treaty of Rome set off in 1957. And there was a long period where just those 6 guys were in it together. We joined together with Denmark and Ireland in 1973. So you can see what a long period the others had to get their act together before anybody else joined the party. That's how it stuck. I mean, we had a referendum a bit later to confirm our entry in 1975. In the 1980s, 3 countries came out of dictatorship: Greece, Spain, and Portugal, and joined. So then we have a brief period where the focus of the European Union really was to upgrade the very poor infrastructure in Ireland and the countries that had come out of dictatorship, all of which were pretty shitholes in terms of their industrial development, not of course in terms of their people. And you begin to think about ideas of the level playing field, which are right back there in the treaty, but the idea that it can't become, it has always been and still is a market. It was called the common market back then, it's now called the European Union. It's got more complex, more involved, but it's basically a market. So in order to make a market that goes right across barriers, across boundaries, across former combatants, what you're saying is, if we're not going to have competition between countries, then all the countries have to accept the same kind of background stuff. So everybody has to have the same restraints on trade. In other words, everybody has to accept trade unions. Everybody has to accept equality legislation. Everybody has to accept product quality legislation. Everybody has to accept all the things that make products more expensive in the view of the market. Okay, this may not be our view, this is how the thing develops. That moved particularly with the Single European Act in 1986, and that's where you see for the first time really a development of, to be able to make, for the European Union to be able to make decisions, they brought in the idea of not having to do everything by unanimity. You get qualified majority voting. So countries can be outvoted. And of course, that's one of the complaints of the right wing, that we can be outvoted and other people can make us do stuff that we didn't want to do. In fact, Britain has seldom been outvoted, but that's beside the point, of course. Other treaties come along. Maastricht is the important one because that set up the euro, which we chose not to join. And then in 1995, Austria, Sweden and Finland joins. And we had really quite a brief period when we had Margaret Thatcher and the European Union's member states were mostly, apart from us, social democratic, and we had Thatcher. So at that point, the unions got very enthusiastic about the European Union because we saw it as a way to get past the crap that Thatcher was inflicting on people. So for a brief period, the sort of tension between social democracy and neoliberalism, social democracy for a little while was upwards, both tensions there, it was upwards. Carry on through some more treaties. The Treaty of the Euro comes in 2002 for most people. And then in 2004, after the fall of the wall in Germany and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the European Union accepts 10 member states at the same time. And I think that changed everything for many reasons. All of the 10 former Eastern European states, plus Cyprus and Malta, joined all in one block. And almost all of those countries were and still are on the right, have right-wing governments. So that means that the European Union is now, and will be, I think, for some time, run by member states who mostly have right-wing governments, neoliberal if you prefer. Since then, 2 more joined, Romania and Bulgaria, because we couldn't quite manage all of them at once. And the latest one in 2013 is Croatia. So that's where we are up to date, with a European Union that now stretches all the way from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, with a hole in the Polar Mint, which is Switzerland's, and there's going to be a hole on the left wing, which will be us. I'm not sure that left wing is quite the right word for Britain at the present time. In 2009, after the accession of the lump of 10 member states all at once, most of whom were former communist states, we have the Treaty of Lisbon, which is one that people go on and on and on about on the internet and generally get it wrong. But one of the things that, in my mind, the Treaty of Lisbon does is it changes the European Union quite fundamentally away from social democracy towards a neoliberal form of economy. And the words are there within the text that shows that change. It doesn't do any of the other crap that people say it does, but it does do that. But on the other side, it brought in the Charter, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is not the Charter of Human Rights, which is quite a different thing, but it's the European Union's version of it, and we signed up to it. So that kind of brings us up to date. We now have the 27 member states, which was 28, but now it's 27. This unwieldy combination of 27 or 28, 27 and a quarter countries is run through 3 institutions: the Council of Ministers, the Commission, and the European Parliament. The Council of Ministers is made up of the Prime Ministers of each of the member states. And they have the last word on just about everything. And that's why the political composition of the member states is what really determines what's going on in the European Union. Behind that, you have the Commission, which is like the civil service. It's powerful, it's strong, and it's divided into directorates. It's like a civil service, divided into different strands. Then you have the European Parliament, which, as you know, is elected every 5 years. And when the MEPs get there, they don't sit in national groups, they sit in political groups, all the way from communists on the left right through to fascists on the right. And sadly, there are far too many of them. Not sure quite how many at the moment, because I haven't counted for a while. It makes decisions a bit like British political institutions do. In other words, the Commission proposes legislation, it goes to the Council of Ministers, and then it goes to the Parliament for consideration. And depending what it's about, it may go around this circle 2 or 3 times. And there are some areas now where the Parliament has co-decision with the Council of Ministers, but there is no area where the Council of Ministers doesn't have a contribution to the final say. So the most important institution really are the member states and their governments. It's been very handy because most of us Brits don't understand how this works, so our governments have always been able to hide behind it, and if they're doing something that we don't like, they just say, well, the European Union made us do it, when they probably actually voted for it in the first place. So with the growth of the European Union into more and more member states, across more and more Europe, and across more and more territory, physical geography, it has acquired more and more wider and wider remit. It's like a council. The European Union can only do what it has been agreed it can do. So every remit it has is one that the nation states have agreed that it has. The British Parliament can do anything it says it can do, except for things it's already decided not to. So it's the opposite way around. It can only do what the member states have agreed for it to do. But the member states, including ours, have agreed for it to do agriculture, communications, looking after its own finances, some matters to do with employment, energy policy, environmental policy, civil protection and humanitarian aid, neighbourhood and enlargement, looking at bringing more people in or making links with other people, statistics, no, stats are quite good, some aspects of health, particularly public health, digital development, justice to some degree, fisheries policy, international development and cooperation, regional policy, and regions are pretty much regions of member states, tax policy in some aspects, particularly to do with VAT, trade policy, and it has a big interest in translation and interpretation because it has to. So it's taken on over time more and more and more functions because the member states have agreed that it should. And some of them are obvious. With environment, it's quite obvious that pollution doesn't stop at national borders. So that's a thing that's much better done right across the member states of the European land. Things like transport policy have become important as more and more we're now able to get a train in London and end up in Athens or end up in Scandinavia. By getting on the train and changing a few times, you can get almost anywhere in Europe. Air policy is also, so transport is actually quite important. Neil Kinnock was in charge of transport for a while. It got worse. He put forward a lot of privatisation directives while he was there. So gradually, more and more areas of policy have become shared, partly because they have to. Energy policy. Did you know that a lot of the energy that you may be consuming tonight comes from the nuclear power stations in the north of France, through long cables under the sea? If we run out of energy, you're running on nuclear energy. And vice versa, of course, if they run out, if they get a bit short, energy comes across from us. But more and more, the market for energy has developed, and the ways in which it's developed have become increasingly interconnected. If you look at where the gas pipes go, you can begin to see what's going on. So the more you integrate your economies, the more there is a need to regulate that integration. And we, as socialists and Labour members, would be very much in favour of regulation and not just letting the market rip and the weakest goes to the wall and so on. It's what we do. So as Britain then decides that it doesn't like this and we want to take back control and we want to stop sharing with everybody in our neighbouring member states, we've then got to disentangle ourselves from all the functions that have been acquired since 1957, which is quite a long time. It's older than me, basically, nearly. And in particular, as the remit of the European Union has grown, the ideas about this level playing field have grown with it. So the more you change the functions and expand things that are subject to international regulation, the more, in order to have a common market, the more you have to say, well, things have got to be kind of the same in all the member states. Otherwise, you'll get competition between states within the market. And that's not what you want. So a lot of the money that wealthy countries like ourselves put, or used to put, into the common pot actually goes to develop the infrastructure in the poorer member states in order that we can sell products into those member states. Early on, Ireland, if any of you remember Ireland as it was 50 years back, before it joined the European Union, the roads were absolutely appalling. The infrastructure was very poorly developed. The hinterland of Ireland was, shall we just say, priest-ridden. but very underdeveloped. And the European Union poured money into Ireland and has since poured it into Portugal, Spain, south of Italy, Liverpool, and now into the countries that are still coming out of the communist period. So that's, although it's often portrayed to us as a nice and generous thing to do, it's done in order that we can sell into those countries, because obviously if you can't get your goods there and people can't afford to buy them, you don't have a market. So in terms of levelling up, and it's always been thought of as levelling up, to try and bring everybody up in the market to the same standard so that the goods can be sold across the market. And of course this also means that there's a big push to homogenise the goods that are sold in the market. So if we say that for our economy, food has to be sold in a way that it won't poison us, so we're going to regulate how food is produced, processed and sold so that we're not poisoned. You say, okay, well, that's got to be the same in Malta, Cyprus, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland. Everybody has to have the same regulation so that, first of all, anything we produce within the market can be sold anywhere within the market. Anything we produce in Britain can be sold anywhere in Britain. Anything we produce in Britain while we're members of the European Union can be sold anywhere in the European Union, because we accept the same standards, and everybody does. Regulation. You begin to see some of the problems that we're looking at in terms of extracting ourselves from the European Union. We, for the moment, are not talking about Northern Ireland. The agreement that was signed by Mr. Johnson and the European Union immediately after the election leaves Northern Ireland in many ways inside the single market, so that there isn't a hard border between Northern Ireland and ERA. That was the way around that. The price for that is the hard border is now between the UK, between Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, and that will remain, because if we're a common market, there has to be a border around it. It's got to be somewhere, and Northern Ireland was always the problem. So what's been going on since, we're also busy talking about the virus that we can't really talk about anything else. But the areas under negotiation are foreign policy, security and defence. And if you get excited about this stuff, there's a 16-page document at the present time available that will tell you where things are going about foreign policy, security and defence, how we're looking at cooperation going forward. Oh shit, I hate that phrase. How we're looking at cooperation for the future. The big problem at the moment is the level playing field. The agreement that Johnson signed does agree to stick to the level playing field, but they don't want to. So no progress is being made at the present time on level playing field, and it's fundamental to the EU. You cannot have a market if people are going to undercut it, and if people are going to have different standards, and so on and so on. So it's one of the really difficult points of disagreement at the present time. So this level playing field idea is critical. There are only 2 remaining negotiating dates at the present time before the 30th of June. The 30th of June is the last date by which the European Union can request a delay to the end of the transition period, which will otherwise happen on the 31st of December of this year. There are 2 more rounds of negotiation programmed. One of them is on the 11th of May, so that's next week, and one of them starts on the 11th of June. So, and that's all that remains to sort out the remaining difficulties. The difficulties are level playing field, overall governance, and the EU is trying to get some issues on the acceptance of common values, and it wants the European Union, the UK, to sign up to the European Charter of Human Rights, and at the present time they don't want to. But the real sticking point is the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice is there in order to resolve disputes about areas of European Union legislation. That's what it does. If you don't want to use it as a dispute resolution mechanism, you need to invent another one. And so far, there's been a failure to invent another one, largely because the EU just says, well, why should we? We've got the ECJ, so why do you want to invent another one when you've already got one? And Britain says, but we don't want to be subordinate to the ECJ, European Court of Justice. So that's, again, one of the really difficult sticking points. The third one is on police and judicial cooperation. And at the moment, I think the thing that most of us know about is the extradition warrants, the international extradition warrants. At the present time, we can get our criminals sent back to us from anywhere within the European Union. After we have left, we will no longer be a part of that agreement. And at the moment, this is not working properly. We can't seem to be able to get an agreement about remaining in this system while not being subject to the decision making that takes place within the system. So all the time, the UK wants to get out of the ways in which decisions are made, and the European Union keeps saying, yes, but this is how decisions are made. There's not a way out. And of course, the one that there's a lot of flannel about is fisheries. And according to the European Union, the UK, although it goes on and on about it, has not yet put forward an alternative text on how fisheries should be treated. And the EU is saying, well, you know, do you want an alternative text? Do you come up with it? And the UK is saying, it's a matter of joint negotiation and so on and so on. So that's the other sticking point. Most of our fishing fleet is actually foreign owned. There's very, very little that's British owned anymore. But hey, let's not go there. Most of what I've told you here has come from the European Union's point of view. And that's largely because the British government refuses to release its negotiating documents. So it's quite difficult to get at their negotiating position without sort of getting at it by looking at the results of what they've done or haven't done. And that's really the only way to be able to get at what it is that they're trying to do, because they think it's secret. So you have to read what the EU says in order to find out what's going on. Northern Ireland is difficult. There are talks going on at the present time, and there's a technical note that was published last week, which is really very technical, but again, anybody who really wants to go there, I'll tell you where to find it. The EU, it means it's partly a negotiating tactic, but partly a preparation for what's looking like a probable departure without an agreement on all of these areas of argument. And they've issued a load of stuff called Getting Ready for the End of the Transition Period. And what they've done is they've issued stakeholder preparedness notices in air transport, animal breeding, animal transport, aviation and maritime security, aviation safety, chemicals, consumer protection and passenger rights, cosmetic products, excise duties, European Works Councils, feed, animals, food law, genetically modified organisms, industrial products, medicinal products, movements of live animals, natural mineral waters, online purchase with subsequent parcel delivery, organic products, plant health, rail transport, and VAT on goods. And all of these readiness notices are setting down what happens in each one of those sectors, and they're not all of the sectors, there are more to come yet, if there is no agreement. Basically, it's saying, well, this is what will happen in each one of these sectors when the European Union legislation no longer applies in that sector. It's perhaps clearest in areas like food, because most of our food labelling legislation is EU legislation. We will not be able to sell produce into the EU if it's not labelled and produced in accordance with EU legislation. That's fairly serious for our farming industry and our food processing industry and the rest of it. Aviation safety, if we leave without an agreement, therefore the European Union safety legislation no longer applies in British law, then pilots will have to look to be certificated in a different certification body than they currently are. Consumer protection. If we are no longer part of the European Union's consumer protection legislation, then if out here I buy something that's originated in the UK, my consumer rights will depend on French law and EU law, even if the producer is in the UK. And that's going, but then so I can get a judgment in the French courts about the non-arrival of my whatever it is. How am I going to get it enforced? The other interesting thing, really, is that if we are no longer members of the European Union and there is no agreement covering these matters, then anybody who is currently a distributor in the European Union of British products overnight becomes an importer, no longer a distributor. They're an importer, which means a whole different set of legislation then applies to them. Also, if we leave the European Union without an agreement, then almost everything, in fact, just about everything, can't think of any exceptions, but probably are some, that comes into the European Union will very likely be stopped at the border for the imposition of excise duties and also to ensure conformity with European legislation, because it can't be sold here unless it conforms to the European legislation. And since we will have walked out of the arrangements for ensuring conformity, then it is highly likely that other ways of ensuring conformity will have to be found. What's a lot of behind the European Union's position is it's frightened, with good reason, that the UK wants to use its departure from the EU in order to be able to undercut EU standards and sell into the EU cheaper than products within the EU by cheapening a lot of the conditions and also the regulation under which goods are produced. That's pretty bad for us as well, of course, the lowering of standards for work, for equality, for legislation, for protective legislation, for chemical protection and health and safety protection and that sort of thing. So that's where we actually stand at the moment, I think, and those is a very broad outline of the areas where negotiation is currently, we just say in difficulty, and the areas where it's most likely to cause future problems. I stop there.